Of all of the many tragedies I've watched unfold during the last third of my life, I don't think anything has been more alarming or destructive than the politicization of everything. Everything is politicized now, and that's not unexpected when you're dealing with a ruthless class of people who have no sense of honor or integrity and whose entire purpose in life is to gain power through political means. And so we see it everywhere. Little League baseball games are politicized. The Girl Scouts are politicized. Healthcare is politicized. Football games on NFL TV, politicized. Everything's politicized. The national anthem is politicized. Our history is politicized. Statues that have been standing in town squares since before slavery are politicized. All of it is politicized. And of all of these, nothing is going to cause us greater harm down the road than watching the intersection of politics and science. In a society where the purpose of public education is to prevent people from learning new ideas and to kind of dumb them down and get them all in the same line so that they'll be good little socialist cogs, you find that one of the things that's least understood in modern society is science. Not so much even scientific results. Those are often impenetrable. I'm talking about what science is. What is it? What is its purpose? Science, to me, is a scalpel. It is a very sharp instrument that can deliver remarkable, amazing, miraculous results when applied carefully and within the limited means for which a scalpel is designed. A scalpel can remove a brain tumor and give a person who might be dead in 4 weeks another 60, 70, 80 years of life or more even. But in order for that to work, first of all, the person holding the scalpel has to know what they're doing. And secondly, the scalpel has to be sharp. But if you've decided that this image of this scalpel that has accomplished so much medical miracle, and you're a politician and you want to take the credibility of this scalpel and apply it to some other things, then what happens? Well, all of a sudden, you find yourself using a scalpel to saw through steel cable, or maybe you're going to use a scalpel to cut down a tree. We can't cut the tree down with the scalpel. The politicians know that. What the politicians want is they want that tree cut down and they want the credibility. They want the glisten, the shine, the credibility of science to be seen attacking their political problems. And all that happens is you ruin the scalpel. And that's exactly what's happened here. I saw in the news today the following article. Well, I'll just read you a snippet or two of it, and then we'll talk about it. And then we'll talk about what science really is and why science is being raped today and has been raped for at least the last 20 years. From Scientific American, no less, inspired choice. Biden appoints sociologist Alondra Nelson to top science post. We'll just stop right there. I mean, I hadn't even scrolled past the headline to know that we're already in deep trouble. Sociology is not science. They may want to call it a science, but it's not. It's not a science. Sociology does have a few hypotheses, that's true. But you can't experimentally test sociology. You can do some experiments with people, some, but that's really more psychology. You certainly can't really have a control group. And the one thing you absolutely cannot do in sociology is provide experiments that provide a result that comes back the same way and in the same quantity. You cannot produce repeatability in sociology. It's not really a science. It really isn't. So off the bat, we know we're in some trouble. Let's read a little further, shall we? Scientists praise U.S. President's selection of the bioethics and social inequality specialist to help lead the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Scientists praise the U.S. President's selection? What does that mean? Scientists praise. We see this all the time. Scientists praise this. Scientists, you see, are a small group of robed individuals. They're clad in scarlet robes, and they exist in a star chamber down below the Capitol building, many, many, many stories down below, with their arcane rituals and the sacrifice of animals and so on. And the scientists have proclaimed that they're in favor of this pick. In fact, they're excited about it. When you hear something like that, scientists praise U.S. President's selection of the bioethics and social blah, 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 you automatically know that you are automatically out of the realm of science. In the first sentence, the first half of the first sentence, you're out of the realm of science, because certainly not all scientists praise this. And that kind of statement gives you the impression, intended to give you the impression, that science is this monolithic body of thought, and it has put the official stamp of approval of science on this appointment. Scientists approve. This is a scientifically approved appointment, and anybody who doesn't like it, obviously, is somebody who's not willing to follow the science. But let's continue. During his presidential campaign, Joe Biden pledged that his administration would address inequality and racism. Now that he's been sworn in as U.S. president, his appointment of a prominent sociologist to the nation's top science office is raising hopes that the changes will extend to the scientific community. Now we get to the guts of it. Alondra Nelson, who has studied the societal impacts of emerging technology as well as racism in science and medicine, let's just stop there. That's not science. She's not a scientist. She is a person who studies scientists. In the same way that if I wanted to be an engineer, I would have to study engineering. But if I was somebody who was interested in social justice, I would be an engineering studies major. I wouldn't be studying engineering, I'd be studying engineers. And there's an entirely different thing here. She's not a scientist, she's scientish. She's a scientish. To continue, Alondra Nelson, who has studied the societal impacts of emerging technology as well as racism in science and medicine, will help lead the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as Deputy Director for Science and Society, Biden announced on January 15th. She has spoken and written about diverse and controversial subjects in bioethics, such as gene editing and direct-to-consumer genetic tests. Now, that's actually a pretty valuable person to have on your board. Somebody who talks about genetics, ethics of genetics, biogenetics, genetic testing. That's great. That's a philosopher. That's not a scientist. That's a philosopher. And now, inadvertently, Scientific American, of all places, has already gotten to the difference between science and philosophy. Science is not a belief system. Science has no ethical or moral conclusions. Science is a method of pinging reality and getting an answer back. And when you don't understand that, everything that follows is going to be just as corrupt as your initial premise. So let's continue for another paragraph or two. Biden's selection is an inspired choice, says Keith Wailoo, a historian of race and health at Princeton University in New Jersey. Again, I'm applying what I know of the scientific method to this particular article. What the hell does Keith Wailoo have to say about science? He's not a scientist. He doesn't know anything about science. For him to say that it's an inspired choice, he's not a scientist. Now, maybe an inspired choice in terms of his politics, and I'm sure that's what he's referring to. But again, once you look at how many falsehoods are embedded in one article in Scientific American, which used to be a respectable magazine, you begin to see how dull this scalpel has become, how utterly incapable of incisive thought modern scientists have become. Absolutely incapable of it. And furthermore, you also see the degree to which they are willing to put that scalpel down in order to conform to the politics of the environment around them. And that doesn't speak very well about the scientific atmosphere or environment here in the United States in 2021 either. Nelson's scholarship on genetics, social inequality, and medical discrimination is deeply insightful and hugely influential across multiple fields, most notably because of its focus on excellence, equity, and fairness in scientific and medical innovation, he wrote in an email to Nature. Fairness in science and medical innovation. Now, what does that mean? Fairness in scientific innovation. Because to me, I don't get any other possible explanation of this, is that some people are not contributing enough science, and that there's not enough scientific breakthroughs being produced by certain aspects of our society, and that's the fault of science because science is racist. Couldn't be any other explanation for it. As if the speed of a falling object has anything to do with the person measuring it. As if the redshift of galaxies, or the spectral absorption that we see from stars, and from which we determine not only their distance but their velocity away from us. As if that information is available to some people with a certain amount of melanin in their skin, but unavailable to other people, and that's why the science has to be restructured. Nelson's appointment to the OSTP comes as the United States and its scientific institutions are grappling with their record on equality and inclusion. I am actually a little more impressed with American scientific record on scientific breakthroughs and the development of not only new knowledge, but new technologies based on that knowledge. That's what I'm most impressed with about American science. I am impressed that American scientists were able to get not one, but two COVID vaccines available in less than 9 months and have them both be 95% or higher in terms of their effectiveness. That alone is an astonishing medical achievement, and it has nothing to do with this sentence. Nothing. It has nothing to do with the equality and inclusion of science. And the article goes on. Although Hispanic and African Americans make up 27.5% of the U.S. population over the age of 21, these groups constitute only 13% of the U.S. science and engineering workforce. Therefore, science is racist. You see, it's all of those racist scientists who, in their part-time, when they're not busy with binoculars, making sure that no colored people come through the gates of the university, then they might be working on things like what happened in the first petosecond after the Big Bang, or what's going on in the state of quantum mechanics on a micro scale, where you're now talking about the pieces that make up the pieces of an atom. No, that's not what they're really doing. Mostly, they're watching the gates to make sure that no more than 13% of the total scientists and engineers in the United States are people of color. That's their main job. The reason that this is so offensive, and not only offensive, but destructive, is because this article makes it clear that there are not as many blacks or Hispanics in science and engineering as there are in the general population. And since this is about a political appointment, clearly the understanding is that there must be some form of institutional racism that's making this possible. One thing that's not mentioned in this article, I notice, just off the top of my head, is the demonization of black students in virtually every school in the country right now if they decide to pursue academic excellence. Because in American schools today, among most black communities, it is considered to be acting white if you do well in school, and somehow that makes you a traitor to your race. You think that might have something to do with it? Something? Because I do. Not mentioned here at all, obviously. And finally, the article concludes with this. During a January 16 event at which Biden introduced his OSTP team, Nelson acknowledged the challenges ahead. Quote, "I believe we have a responsibility to work together to make sure that our science and technology reflects us." Here's a news flash for you, Ms. Nelson. And by the way, I have no doubt that you're a brilliant person. I have no doubt that you're a very capable person. But this is not science, and this kind of attitude is something that should not be in the Office of Science and Technology. And the main reason for that is because there shouldn't be an Office of Science and Technology anyway. But nevertheless, when she says, "I believe we have a responsibility to work together to make sure that our science and technology reflects us," well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but our science and technology reflects us right now, because the technology and the science don't care who makes the breakthroughs. They don't care. This idea that we need to protect science from racism and sexual bias and all the rest of it is ridiculous because it's redundant. The scientific method is designed for one reason only. It is designed to get individual people's prejudices out of the system. That's why science is as effective as it is. It is a codified series of steps that return information, but these steps have to be reproducible by anybody, not just by white people, not just by straight white Christian males. If the scientific results are to be taken seriously, then they have to be reproducible by anybody. The results don't care. All of this is designed to remove human prejudices, human conceits, human errors from the system. And when it's allowed to work, it works very, very well. But if you start telling the method that you are no longer going to be searching for error, you're going to be searching for other things like racial quotas or diversity or any of that stuff, tolerance and inclusion, then you weaken the process which has provided us with so many benefits, not the least of which is the fact that we live to be an average of 70 or 80 years old instead of 20 years old. You cannot do this to science. You can't rape science like this without the science basically fighting back. And fighting back means returning fewer and fewer results with lower and lower accuracy. You will often hear people today say, well, I'm not religious. No. And I'm not one of those global warming deniers or those mask deniers. I believe in science. Anytime ever, you ever hear a person say, I believe in science, you got to stop them right there if you're so inclined. Because science is not a belief system. Science is not a religion. Science is not a code of values. Science is none of those things. Science is a very specific set of instructions and procedures designed to produce a ping of knowledge coming back from nature. When you hear somebody say, I believe in science, that's an indication they have no idea what science is at all. None. They have no idea what science is. What they're basically saying is, I believe in scientists, which really means I believe in authority figures. Science is available to everybody, and the two greatest scientific breakthroughs in human history did not occur in laboratories. One of them occurred in a garden of a country gentleman, and the other one occurred in a patent office in Bern, Switzerland. Isaac Newton saw an apple fall to the ground and wondered what it was that attracted the apple to the ground. Albert Einstein, who was told he'd never amount to anything in school, by the way, was bored filling out patent applications in Switzerland, and in his free time he decided he might as well just do some thought experiments, like what would happen if you're driving a car at the speed of light and you turn the headlights on, from which he was able to discern the entire structure of the universe and distill it into an equation that was so stunningly elegant that it absolutely had to be true, and that, of course, is E equals mc squared. Energy equals the mass of the object times the speed of light squared. That's what science is. It's not a belief system. You can't say I believe in science. It's like saying I believe in a chainsaw or I believe in a scalpel. What? I'm not a religious person. I believe in cutlery. What else is it and isn't? Well, another thing that science is not is it is not a warehouse of data, and it's not a warehouse of knowledge. It is absolutely true that there's a great deal of scientific knowledge, and it's also true that most every succeeding breakthrough is accomplished with an understanding of the scientific data that came before. Newton himself said, if I see so far, it is only because I stand on the shoulders of giants. Certainly it's true that anything that comes next has to be based upon what came before, but time and time and time again, in all the classical scientific experiments, we find that this isn't the case at all. For example, for thousands and thousands of years, century after century, generation after generation, people believed that a heavy ball will fall to the earth faster than a lighter one will. They believed this for thousands of years because this is what Aristotle taught. Aristotle was a brilliant Greek, and so therefore it must be true. For thousands of years, people had decided that the science was settled on this one, that the great authority had made a pronouncement, and therefore that's settled. And just think for a minute, just think that for thousands of years, a theory that was that easy to prove went untested until Galileo basically decided to go to the top of a tall tower and drop a heavy ball and a light ball at the same time, and to his astonishment, and to mine as well, to be perfectly honest with you, they land at exactly the same time. And for those of you who might be curious as to how that actually works, the way I learned how to understand it a little better was to realize that when those two balls are falling, both of them have the exact same weight, which is 0. Those two balls, while they're falling, are both weightless. Weight is the pressure exerted by a mass against something resisting it, like the ground or your bathroom scale against the pull of gravity. But the science had been settled, and Galileo just decided no. And now we get to what science really is. Because when Galileo said, no, it's not true, a heavy ball and a light ball fall at the same rate, Undoubtedly, this caused consternation around the entire world. And the beautiful thing about science is that anybody, anywhere, could reproduce that classic experiment, maybe the simplest experiment of all time. Anybody could reproduce it and get the same results for themselves. Now, if you think that happens in sociology, you're mistaken. That's what science actually is. That's what it is. Did Galileo believe in science? No. Galileo believed that nature could be understood. That's not science. That's naturalism and many other philosophies. But it's not science. Science is the method of saying, well, if this is true, we should be able to prove it. Let's take a heavy ball and a light ball. Let's go up 10 stories and drop them and see what happens. That's the science. Which brings us finally to the great aneurysm of politics and science in society today, and that, of course, is the so-called climate change. Joe Biden has announced that American companies will have to perform draconian measures in order to reach arbitrary numbers, arbitrarily assigned by an arbitrary group of people who have arbitrary objectives. And for this, he will essentially make electricity much more expensive for regular people, but they don't care about that because they believe in science, you see. So let me just say one thing about climate change. And it's simply this. I'm not arguing about whether the climate is changing or not. I'm really not. I'm not qualified to analyze that data. I'm not. But when you hear people say things like, we have to do this to save the Earth, we're at 425 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and if we get to 450 parts per million, then it's all over. The world's going to burn, the ice caps will melt, and the planet will flood, and so on. When you hear scientists scaring the living daylights out of citizens in order to get done what they think needs to be done, all I want is somebody to stand up and say, I have a question. It is irrefutably proven that 80 million years ago, right here in the United States, there was an inland sea because, correct, all of the ice had melted and the CO2 levels were something like 3,000 parts per million. 3,000, not 450, 3,000. And the center of the country, which is now nothing but just grassy plains, was filled with all kinds of life. There were ferns and dinosaurs and all kinds of groovy things going on there. So, my two questions for you are, number one, whose SUVs caused that climate to reach 3,000 parts per million CO2, which is not up for discussion? And more importantly, how is it possible that the Earth on its own, long before humans appeared as a technological species, how was the Earth able to go from 3,000 parts per million carbon dioxide 80 million years ago down to about 150 parts per million 80,000 years ago, when all of that ice not only refroze, but basically formed glaciers a mile deep? Kansas used to be underneath 2 miles of water, and then it was underneath a mile of ice, and we didn't have anything to do with it. So my question to you, as a scientific question, what was the cause of those climate changes? And more importantly, if the Earth was able to recover from both of those extremes, which we are not even remotely close to or even on the board, what makes you say that the situation we're in now is different? That's a scientific question that would have a scientific answer. And if somebody were to say to me, well, the reasons that this is worrisome, Bill, is because this was the formal argument on global warming, was that the warming is occurring at a rate that's never occurred before. Well, at least that's interesting. That's something there. But when you say we're doing this to prevent climate change, this is an anti-scientific term. And the response to people on this who doubt it, when they're called skeptics in a derisive fashion, as if skepticism was somehow not the essence of what science is. Science is codified skepticism. That's what science is. And when somebody labels you as a skeptic or a denier, then you have your best evidence ever that this person hasn't got the faintest idea what science is about, not even a clue. Because as Galileo showed, It didn't matter if the science was settled. It didn't matter how many scientists agreed that the science was settled. All that mattered is that Galileo decided to drop these two balls and they landed at the same time. And that experiment was repeatable all around the globe by any culture, any skin color, any sexual orientation. Anybody could have done that exact same experiment and did. And that proved that that was true. And unless we understand that this is what science is, we will continue to dull this scalpel. Because when politicians try to use that mantle of science, that amazingly successful, limited method of thinking, when they try to marry their politics to science, what they're trying to do is gain the credibility of science and apply it to their politics. But that's not what happens. All that happens is that science is degraded. Science is raped by the politics. It's science that suffers because science doesn't have any politics, doesn't have any racial preferences, doesn't have any sexual preferences, none of that. It is what it is, and any attempt to make this a political issue is to doom our culture, our children, and our future to a world that is ever more politicized and ever less rational, where the science of the future will be conducted anywhere but right here.